All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. And I'm happy to welcome fellow O's fan, David A. Graham. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic. He is the author of the Atlantic Daily Newsletter, and December edition is going to be very interesting. Your column there is called Donald Trump's Plan to Subvert the Midterm is already underway. He's also the author of The Project, How Project 2025 is Reshaping America and the World. David A. Graham, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
Great to have you here. I guess we should start. I mean, it's not what we're going to talk about mostly, but just as we're recording this, the breaking news where apparently Democrats have released an email from Jeffrey Epstein that suggests that Donald Trump knew about the girls, whatever that means. Like, what do you think, what's going to happen? How big of a deal do you think this is?
I mean, it's one of these messages that I think people are going to read it the way they want to read it. And it's written vaguely enough that I'm not sure it's a smoking gun. I mean, we have Trump back in 2003 telling New York Mag that, Jeffrey Epstein loves women, especially on the young side. So I feel like in some ways we knew that Trump knew about this, but I'm curious to see, as we sort of read through this, what else we can get from it and what kind of impact it has.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I think if you're predisposed to believe that Trump was involved in something nefarious, this would appear to be a smoking gun. If you're not, then you can dismiss it just like that. Remember the letter that Donald Trump wrote for the
Right.
birthday, 50th birthday for Epstein or whatever. But I would say if you're a conspiratorial person, this certainly feeds the conspiracy theory flame, right?
Yeah. Well, and especially when we see more reporting on Ghislaine Maxwell potentially getting, you know, uh, um, applying for clemency and getting easy duty in prison. There continues to be lots of smoke if you're looking for it.
I wonder if Democrats are going to be able to we have these like different stories, but you can push them into a single narrative, right? You've got like the Jeffrey Epstein story, which sort of is close to the Gatsby party, the great Gatsby party that Trump just had down in Mar-a-Lago with all the scantily clad dancers and women and martini cups and all of that. And then you've got Trump doing the ballroom and the Lincoln, the bathroom and the Lincoln bedroom. And then talking about how like affordability is not really a big issue and it's all a con job. And I wonder if Democrats can take all of that because there's sort of like there's cronyism, like the pardons of crypto bros who might be helping give the Trump family money. I mean, I don't know how you can put that together into one coherent narrative, but you would think that they could figure out how to do
I'm not sure I would think that this Democratic Party could do that.
that.
Somebody could do it.
Yeah, like I feel like, in the olden days, like a Carvel Bagala type would have been able to like, we're gonna bash him over the head with this. We're gonna, they'll come up with like a slogan and they would repeat it a million times, but they would have had the media too repeating it. And that's a big difference now. It's like you could just be watching Fox News all day and have no idea that this is even happening, right?
It's interesting also to see. I mean, we're going to I assume we'll get this discharge petition. We're going to get Epstein files in some variety or a vote on it. And then we'll see if there's actually something there. In some ways, having it hanging there and having, refusing to swear in Adelita Grijalva, for example, all of these things have created more anticipation. And I wonder whether the anticipation is actually more politically potent than actually having the goods.
Yeah, I think so. Well, okay. To be continued. All this stuff is happening. We just had elections last week. And I do think that, I don't know if the Epstein charge had any bearing on the way people voted, but I do think that kind of like the sense that Trump is now out of touch, the government shutdown that I think really impacted the Virginia elections and like the sense that he was maybe aloof and didn't care about affordability probably played into it. So it does appear, with the gerrymandering, as you've noted, the fact that they're going to all this trouble to try to, create these new Republican districts suggests that there will indeed be elections in 2026. But at the same time, as you warn in this piece in the Atlantic, this big, kind of write up in the Atlantic that Donald Trump's plan to subvert the midterms is already underway. And you open up talking about, things like federal troops, polling machine seizures, chaos. Is that like your worst case scenario, or is that like get ready because this is likely to happen?
I think that is my worst case scenario, but I wanted to make it something that was plausible too. So I sort of went through talking to all these people about what might happen. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the way election subversion works is there's so many ways you can try to do it. It's not like a single playbook, and so I wanted to kind of put all those things together in one place and see how it might play out, because I think it is hard to get your head around it. I mean, our election system is just so complicated and so diffuse, and there's so many things that play into it. Um, whether that is the actual elections or the media or the districts or certification in the House. I wanted to get that together.
Whether we're talking about stealing elections, rigging elections, or whether we're talking about Project 2025, which you have also written a book about, it really strikes me that Trump and his team, probably his team more likely, have just benefited from, they had a halftime. They had the first
Yeah.
term, and then they had 4 years to game things out and study. How important do you think those 4 years were in terms of what we've seen, both with your book and this Atlantic splashy piece?
That's such a great connection that I hadn't put together, but I think it's exactly right. I mean, if you look at Project 2025, it's so specifically a response to the first Trump term and a feeling among a lot of the people involved that Trump's first term had underachieved because they didn't have the right staffing, they didn't have the right plan. And if they came back, they weren't going to squander the opportunity. And I think the same is true on election stuff. Something that I heard from people sort of on the other side is they've gotten a lot smarter. And I think David Frum has used the analogy of the raptors learning to turn the doorknobs in Jurassic Park, and there's a little bit of that going on. In 2020, we saw Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani giving these sort of clownish approaches, and they're a lot more prepared now. They understand the law better. They're not sort of reading it in real time and trying to come up with it. They have the smartest legal minds in the movement working on it, and they're preparing years ahead of time instead of days or hours ahead of time.
And Powell and Giuliani, among others, have now been pardoned or had their sentences commuted, or Rudy's now trying to get his law license back and all of that, which, I mean, I think clearly sends a signal to people who may be useful in the future that we've got your back.
Yeah, we'll take care of you.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So describe, if you would, the difference between structuring a system that incentivizes your outcomes versus stealing an election. Because I think there is a distinction to be made between, you can call it rigging if you tilt the field your way and you still happen to win. People actually show up and vote, but you've just moved some pieces around to make it more likely you're going to win, versus jackbooted thugs coming in and
Right.
grabbing ballot bit boxes or something.
Yeah, it's a really good distinction. I think there's so many ways in which the goal is to kind of change the rules, not to break the rules. Gerrymandering is a great example of that. There are some challenges to these, but generally it is legal to redistrict. It might be politically unsavory, but you can do that. So you're changing the rules of the election. You can also, there's all these things that we talk about the media environment being different. You have not only Fox News, which is very much, in the president's camp, but also you use the FCC to kind of bully ABC and CBS. And if not necessarily to get them on the team, to make sure they're not going to be too aggressive. You start intimidating opponents in ways that uses the force of law. So, for example, you investigate Adam Schiff or you charge James Comey. It may be an abuse of power, but it's not. It's sort of outside of the election system, and it helps to make your opponents, donors, voters, volunteers, candidates, less willing to want to get into things, less willing to want to take risks. So all these things come together to create an environment where the field is tilted towards you. And there is an election. It's generally free once you get to the polls, but it's just much harder for the opponents to really compete. And that's what we've seen, in other countries. That's kind of the Turkish model. There is a Turkish opposition. They run in elections and they lose every election because Erdogan has a media establishment and a society rigged or tilted to his benefit.
Like the Washington Generals.
Right, exactly.
So I'm wondering about the motive, right? So on one hand, you could argue the midterms don't really matter that much, right? I mean, Donald Trump, he can still get Supreme Court nominees confirmed through the U.S. Senate. He's already governing by virtue of issuing executive orders and things like that. He's not doesn't have a grand legislative plan anyway, and Republicans barely own the House. It's such a slim majority. So you could argue it doesn't matter that much. And I'm just wondering about the motive. I can give you a couple theories. Like one theory would be he's afraid he doesn't want to get impeached again for a third time. And then another theory would be like, well, it's not even about 2026. This is like a trial run for 2028 to sort of test the system. I don't want to be too crazy, too conspiratorial. Like, what is your theory as to why Trump would even want to take his time away from redesigning the White House to focus on this?
He's very busy. I think it's a really good question. And I think I struggle a little bit with that question about 2026. We see from Trump and from allies of Trump's, Bannon, for example, has talked about this, a real fear about the midterms. And I think impeachment is a lot of that. Even though it's very clear that Democrats are not going to have votes to convict Trump in the Senate. Even if they're able to win the Senate, they're not going to have votes to convict. But Trump really doesn't like those impeachments, and it seems to be a concern for him. I think he's also really worried about the kind of noise that a Democratic House would make in oversight. They're obviously not going to pass laws that he wants, and they barely do have the House, as you say. But there's ways that they can use subpoena power, and I think create what he sees as mischief. And that kind of fear seems to really drive him, even as he's, working around Congress on many other things. He doesn't want to lose control of it. But I also think, like, at the risk of sounding conspiratorial, the 2028 question is it. There are so many things that seem to be preparation for future elections. We saw Trump start, in October 2016, he was saying that the election was going to be rigged. After he won it, he said that it had been rigged. So all of these kinds of things build on it themselves. We saw it in 2020. So he's sort of working up to it. He didn't have to do any of these things in 2024 because he won by such a clear margin. But he was prepared to say it was rigged, and he was making those ideas then too. So I think he's testing a lot of the things. And when we saw election monitors in California last week, for example, a lot of the people in the sort of legal sphere around elections are concerned that that is a test run for 2026. You send out monitors and it can be intimidation. You test it now and it can be intimidation then in the midterms. And then you've refined your methods for 2028.
But, Democrats had a great night in 2025 last week. Nobody said that those elections were stolen in 2025. Is it because the stakes are just so much lower? Or is it because if Democrats win by 10 points, no one's going to challenge the veracity of that?
I think it's a little bit of both. Those are, look, we're looking at Virginia, which is effectively a blue state, New Jersey, which is a blue state, California, which is a blue state, New York, which is, a pink city, I guess. And so I think, there's not really a real basis to challenge there. Although we saw the White House saying that there was fraud in California mail balloting without providing a whole lot of evidence.
Wait, when you say it's a pink city, is this like communist red or is this
exactly.
Republican red? It's
More
gotten really confusing.
It's a little socialist. Exactly. The colors are. Yeah. I do think that the margin makes a lot of difference. And, that was the case in 2024. And I think it's what we'll see in 2026 too. If Democrats win the House by 10 seats, there's not a lot that you can do on that. I mean, you can chart ahead of time by trying to, redistrict and make it a harder map for them. But on election night, if it's a wide win, that's kind of the end of the ballgame. It's if you have 3 to 5 seats that are divided by, 2, 3, 4%, that's where you have to start worrying about mischief and where somebody could, try to change the outcome.
Now, Democrats had 4 years to try to kind of mitigate this possibility and create a bulwark. And I think, they did some things, but they've also been criticized. So, for example, Merrick Garland, the former attorney general, for not moving quick enough and indictments and things like that. Did Democrats do anything during those 4 years to prevent the possibility that Trump or someone else down the road could capitalize on maybe the weaknesses or the vulnerabilities in our system?
I think one thing that went really well during that time was Electoral Count Act reform, which means we're less likely to see something like January 6th again. And that's a presidential election question, more of a 2028 thing. But I do think that is an improvement. That was a law that was ambiguous. People had been warning it was ambiguous, and then we saw the problems there. So that's good. I think other than that, the report card is not great. There is the Justice Department being really slow on election subversion cases. And we have a lot of evidence. All those things came out, but not a lot of action. And now we've seen people pardoned for it. We saw Democrats take a kind of curious approach on what they wanted to do with voting laws. It was House Bill 1 in the Biden administration, which was this big election reform measure, but it ended up getting bottled up because it was something even many election advocates thought had bad ideas in it. And they were unable to pass it in the House, much less get it passed into law. So I think there's some missed opportunities there. That said, some of what makes the election system so confusing and also, I think, is a source of resilience is that so much of it is at the state level. And so in some states, you've got good laws, and in some states, you have bad laws. And there's sort of a limited role for Congress in those things, and a limited role for Trump, I think, to his chagrin.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, right? You could imagine a world where progressives would want some top-down election reform where instead of these 50 states doing it in this patchwork, piecemeal sort of way, you would have one election czar who's in charge of it all. And that maybe sounds like it'd be more efficient, but actually, that's only one person that the president would then
Right.
need to
Yeah, I
co-opt
mean,
or order.
you don't have to go back very many years to hear those kinds of arguments. I mean, elections shouldn't be run at the state level. It's too, you get too many different standards. You can't trust every state to do it well. The funding is inconsistent. The federal government needs to take it over. You do not hear those things from Democrats these days.
It's one area where the founders, I think, definitely were wise and ahead of they foresaw this problem. So that is great. So if you would then talk a little bit, I mean, this makes it harder for someone like a Donald Trump if he wanted to try to meddle or put his thumb on the scale. But how does it now work when you have to manage these 50 separate elections? Oh, and by the way, let me just say, not only is it great for keeping like an internal coup, the current president from trying to, but like if Russia tried to hack the elections, they would
Right.
have to hack 50 different, and they're using like different computers and
Right.
so it's such a safeguard, like a firewall. So it's just brilliant. But then how would someone go about doing it if they wanted to?
So there's a few things you might do. One is you would run election deniers for local offices that control these elections. And we've seen that in places where sort of MAGA folks have gotten elected to county offices or even state offices. So I think about Maricopa County, Arizona, which was obviously very controversial in 2020, and where one of the things that held Trump back was the presence of a bunch of Republicans on the local boards who resisted any effort to subvert those elections. Many of them then lost office or decided not to run because they were under so much pressure. So you can infiltrate those areas through the election process. You can also use the Justice Department to kind of try to pressure those offices to demand information from them, to tell them they need to do certain things. And I talked to Stephen Richer, who was the recorder in Maricopa County starting in 2021 and was a target for Trump. And he said, if you're a local elections official, it's really hard to trust your judgment over the U.S. Department of Justice. If the Attorney General is telling you something, like, who are you going to believe? And maybe you don't believe the Attorney General, but that's a lot of force that you're resisting. So that's tricky. And it's even harder if you're not if you're in a major county, you're probably going to have better legal advice. If you're in some small county, you don't have the same infrastructure around you. You might have the president calling people and asking them to change their votes or to change their process. We saw that in 2020, and we heard Trump's call to Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State. He didn't face any serious consequences for that. I guess I would expect him to try that sort of thing again. And we also saw, Rudy Giuliani talking to state legislators and a bunch of things along those lines. So there's all these ways you can kind of put pressure there. That works only on a small scale, though. You can change a district here or there. You can maybe change a county. And that's why a close election is much more fragile than a wide one.
Yeah, which is why the gerrymandering really matters, even if Democrats are still able to, overcome. It's not insurmountable for them taking back the House, let's say, but now they take it back by a few votes. Just like, I mean, right now Republicans have a very slim majority, so it's totally
Right.
possible. It could come down to a couple seats, and crazy. And so you also sketch out a pathway for what might happen after Election Day, right? So you just talked about Trump making calls, but there's litigation, blockage of vote counts, claims of vote fraud. Do you see the 2026 midterms as, how likely do you see that scenario, let's say, playing out?
I think that the question of trying to seize voting machines is one that we need to be really careful about. We saw Trump talk about that in 2020, and it was something that it was brought up in some conversations. We learned from the House January 6th committee, and a bunch of people said you can't do it. Bill Barr said the Justice Department can't do this. Ken Cuccinelli said the Department of Homeland Security can't do it. People said the Pentagon can't do it, but they tried all of these options. And we see, we have a Justice Department that is much more of a political tool of the White House. We have a Defense Department that is much more of a tool of the White House, and we have a Homeland Security Department. So all of these things, like the internal safeguards there, are much weaker. And if you have seizure of those voting machines, that's a real problem. You break the chain of custody. You're going to have half the country that doesn't believe whatever the administration says. Even if there was some sort of tweaking, you're creating doubt, and you're creating a really scary scenario for faith in elections.
Yeah, I feel like if you're a Democrat, not only do you have to win, but you have to win convincingly, and you have to win the PR battle that election night. You want it to be called quickly.
Right.
So, look, I think when it comes to 2028, anything they can do to also expedite counting, especially counting like mail-in ballots and early votes, if you could pass laws between now and then, and that may be very difficult to do, like I think that would be a big help, because what you don't want is things hanging around for a day or two or three, and the propaganda machine starts
Well, that's
making up.
especially risky for Democrats, too, because two of the states that are worst about counting votes are California and New York, where you're going to have a bunch of races that might be close. We've seen California working to redistrict. We don't know how close they're going to be, but if there are outstanding races there, those are going to be sitting there, and Trump is going to say, why do you not have these votes counted? And it's an embarrassment that these states can't count their votes sooner. Whether they're, even without any question of legitimacy, you should be able to count your votes faster.
If Gavin Newsom wants to keep on the roll he's been on, he should make that his next top priority after Prop 50. So, and you just mentioned how, Trump in the first term had these hardcore partisans like Ken Cuccinelli, Bill Barr. These are not squishes or rhinos, but they believe in principles and the rule of law. Those people are now gone, right? And so in your book about Project 2025, you go back to a small circle of thinkers tapped by the Heritage Foundation, which is in the news right now, as you know, because they're embroiled in this whole scandal about Tucker Carlson laundering the views of Nick Fuentes, the white nationalist and Holocaust denier. Talk, if you would, about who were these early architects? Who were these people at Heritage? Because I'm telling you, I think these two stories are so interrelated, and the only way that you could pull off, trying to overturn a free and fair election is to have not only people who believe in you, like philosophically, but who are willing to be loyal to your goals, even if they fly in the face of the Constitution, the rule of law, and decency.
Yeah, I think that kind of mindset is really important to Project 2025. The three people I think of most are Kevin Roberts, who has been in the spotlight here for standing by Carlson, and then has gotten a lot of blowback internally. I think prior to that, his big turn in the spotlight was around July 4th, 2024, when he said we were in the midst of a second American Revolution, which would be bloodless if the left allows it to be. And he took over Heritage after running the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And he was coming to a Heritage that had been kind of shut out in the first Trump administration. They didn't really seem very central to the agenda. They didn't have close ties to the White House. They even clashed on some issues. And he wanted to restore that. He asked Paul Dans to lead Project 2025. And Paul Dans is this guy who, also a really interesting character, describes himself as coming from a kind of Kennedy Democrat family. His parents met in Washington working for the government. And he had gradually moved right. He was a Federalist Society member in college, and then went to work in corporate law. And he was an early Trump supporter, even going back to 2011. He was, really on board with the Trump presidential run. And in 2016, when Trump won, He thought, great, I'm going to get a great job at the Justice Department. I have this good resume. I've been in. Couldn't get any job. And he finally got in at Housing and Urban Development and then very slowly moved his way up and made it to the White House. And what he took from that experience was that the administration was full of people who just weren't loyal. They were, they were Bush Republicans, they were rhinos, they were too loyal to what they saw as the rules. And he has almost as much vitriol for those people as he does for, for the deep state, for like bureaucrats. And he wanted to make sure that that wasn't a problem. So a big part of Project 2025 was finding the right people to staff the administration and fill jobs who would be, on board with the program and would do whatever it took to get it done. And then the third person is Russell Vogt, who maybe is the best known of these, the head of the Office of Management and Budget, both in the end of the first Trump term and then again. And what Vogt brings is this real just knowledge of government and an ability to make things happen. And his insight was seeing how he could use OMB to rework the functioning of the executive branch, to use OMB to tell departments what to do, to use OMB to manage government much more than it previously has been. And that includes making sure you have the people you want in positions and that they answer to the White House in exactly the way that the White House wants.
Indeed. Which, look, I mean, if you can imagine a scenario where that's purely noble, you would want true believers. And
yeah, you want people who are trying to do. I mean, I think one of the things that I found troubling in the first Trump term was you had people who were bragging about not following orders. And it's really, on the one hand, you're talking about ideas that seem really bad. On the other hand, like these are, in fact, as Trump said, unelected bureaucrats, not people who have faced voters. They shouldn't be making these decisions on their own.
And you could argue they did a disservice to us, because if Trump had implemented his strategies and they failed, then either he would have changed course on his own, or the public might have rejected him based on that. But because they were sort of pulling his punches,
right?
Maybe that's why we got round 2 of Trump.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. If you get you shouldn't follow an unlawful order, but there are lots of cases of lawful but misguided orders. I don't know. I don't agree with a lot of those things, but I don't want somebody simply making a decision on their own that they're not going to follow it.
Right. And so I think when it comes to, like, if the president wants to implement, a policy you disagree with, but it's lawful, that's different than having loyalists who are prepared to be a part of some sort of coup and disregard the Constitution, the rule of law, and all those things.
Yeah, exactly. That's the line. And you hear Russell Vogt saying things like we're in a post-constitutional moment. And I think that's pretty worrying.
Yeah, and it's so weird too. I mean, I'm beating a dead horse here, but like, he came up, I think, through the conservative movement and during a time of like the Tea Party, when the Constitution was, like, I think rightly, heralded as like the, what we're doing. The whole point
Right.
of being in politics is to defend and uphold the Constitution and get back to the Constitution. So it's troubling and ironic. Let me end with this. If you could identify the single most underappreciated risk your article in The Atlantic raises, one that we didn't talk about maybe, that might surprise people, and or maybe you could share some hope or optimism instead, depending on how you're feeling.
Let me give you one of each. I think, I don't know if this is underappreciated, but I do. We haven't talked as much about the idea of the military being involved or federal law enforcement being out, and it's something that when I started reporting this story struck me as a kind of social media fever dream that you saw people worrying about that wasn't a concern. And I was struck by how many people who are not hair on fire folks, who are, sober, professional, low key, are really concerned about how Trump might use the National Guard or regular military to try to interfere with elections. And so I think that's something that people should take seriously as a real risk and not just kind of hyperbole. But I do think there is a lot of hope. And I think it's important to talk about that. Like, I don't want to give the impression that the 2026 elections are going to be a mess and there's nothing we can do about it. Because I do think the resilience of the system through local officials is really important. We see people who do these jobs not for a lot of money, not for glory, not for partisan reasons, who just want elections to run really well. And I think that's most of the people we have running elections. And that's a real strength. I think that's the sort of thing that makes me feel good about America. And I think it makes me feel good about the outcome of elections. And the other thing I'd say is, we saw in 2020 an attempt to subvert an election. And what we saw is that voters insisted their voices be heard. They voted in droves, and it was some of the best turnout we've had in this country in a presidential election in a very long time. And democracy won in that case. And I think we need to remember the best antidote to anti-democratic actions is democracy. That's what we have.
What do you think of the idea? I lied. Last question. What do you think of the idea? Because you're talking about the good people who are, out there making this work. The idea of like a draft where it's like jury duty, where every 2 years, citizens get randomly called up to go work at a certain precinct and to help monitor or oversee elections. Good idea, bad idea? What do you think?
I think it's a good idea. I mean, one thing is that people have a lot of questions about the voting system, and conspiracy theories spread because it's complicated and hard to understand. And there are people who will not be convinced. But sometimes something you hear a lot is folks have questions. They go to their local board of elections. Somebody walks them through the way the system works, and they come out of it with much more understanding, and they no longer have the kind of doubts they do. I think if you get people doing that work, it's really good. It's great community service. It's great for people to be involved in our government in that way. So I think that's a great idea.
Love it. All right, everybody, read the piece in The Atlantic. Donald Trump's plan to subvert the midterms is already underway. That's the December issue. I always get confused how that works. And get the book, The Project, How Project 2025, Reshaping America. David A. Graham, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.